Marcus Chun wiped the sweat from his brow as he adjusted the plasma torch settings on his mining equipment. The asteroid belt of Kepler 442 had been his home for the past 3 years, ever since the terraforming project on his home colony had failed spectacularly. Out here, among the floating rocks and cosmic debris, a man could make an honest living extracting rare minerals without having to deal with the politics and bureaucracy of the inner systems. The warning klaxon on his ship, the Wanderer's Dream, suddenly pierced the silence of space. Marcus frowned and checked his scanners. Something massive was approaching from the direction of the Void Sector, a region of space that even the most hardened prospectors avoided. The energy signature was unlike anything in his databases. Through his viewport, Marcus saw it emerge from the cosmic dust clouds like a nightmare made manifest. The creature was enormous, easily the size of a heavy cruiser, with obsidian scales that seemed to absorb light itself. Its wings, stretched wide enough to shadow a small moon, carried it through the vacuum with impossible grace. This was a void dragon, one of the legendary apex predators that haunted the dead systems beyond civilized space. Marcus had heard the stories in the mining stations and frontier bars. Void dragons were said to be the ultimate killers of the galaxy, creatures that could survive in the vacuum of space, breathe plasma hot enough to melt starship hulls, and possessed intelligence that rivaled the most advanced AI systems. They were supposedly extinct, wiped out during the Great Purge 2 centuries ago, when the Galactic Coalition decided that nothing so dangerous should be allowed to exist. Apparently, the Coalition had been wrong. The dragon's condition was immediately apparent, even from a distance. Deep gashes ran along its flanks, leaking a luminescent blue fluid that froze instantly in the cold of space. Its left wing hung at an awkward angle, clearly damaged, and its flight pattern was erratic. Whatever had done this to the creature must have been incredibly powerful or incredibly lucky. Marcus reached for his communication array, intending to alert the nearest Coalition patrol, but something made him pause. The dragon wasn't attacking. It wasn't even heading toward inhabited space. Instead, it seemed to be struggling toward the asteroid field, moving with the desperate determination of a wounded animal seeking shelter. As the creature drew closer, Marcus noticed something that made his blood run cold. Attached to the dragon's back, barely visible against the dark scales, were metallic objects that pulsed with an ominous red light. Extraction devices. Someone had been harvesting from this creature while it was still alive, cutting away pieces of its hide and organs for their legendary properties. The practice was barbaric and highly illegal, but that had never stopped the black market organ traders who operated in the Outer Rim. Dragon scales could deflect energy weapons. Dragon blood was rumored to extend human lifespan, and dragon organs were supposedly capable of powering entire space stations. The fact that someone had actually found a living void dragon and tortured it for profit made Marcus's stomach churn. The dragon suddenly veered toward his position, its massive head turning to fix him with eyes like burning stars. Marcus instinctively reached for his ship's weapons controls, but, again, something made him hesitate. The creature's gaze held intelligence, yes, but also something else. Pain, desperation, and, underneath it all, a plea for help that transcended species barriers. Marcus Chun had always been a practical man. He minded his own business, kept his head down, and survived in a galaxy that didn't much care about individual miners working the asteroid fields. But, looking into those ancient, suffering eyes, he found that practicality had its limits. The dragon's flight became increasingly erratic as it approached the asteroid field. Whatever internal injuries it had sustained were clearly taking their toll. Marcus watched in fascination and growing concern as the creature attempted to land on one of the larger asteroids, only to crash heavily into its surface, sending up clouds of dust and debris. Marcus fired up his ship's engines and moved closer, keeping his weapons powered down as a gesture of non-aggression. As he approached the crash site, he could see the full extent of the dragon's injuries. The extraction devices were still embedded in its hide, slowly draining its life force. Burns and cuts covered its body, and the blue luminescent blood that served as its life fluid was spreading across the asteroid's surface in growing pools. But it was what he saw next that changed everything. Huddled beneath the dragon's massive wing, barely visible in the shadows, were three small forms. At first, Marcus thought they might be some kind of parasites or symbiotic creatures, but as his ship's lights illuminated the scene, he realized the truth. They were juveniles, baby dragons, no larger than house cats, with scales that shimmered between deep purple and midnight black. The adult dragon, despite its grievous injuries, had positioned itself protectively over the younglings. Its head remained raised, watching Marcus's ship with wary intelligence, ready to defend its offspring with whatever strength remained. Marcus understood immediately what had happened. The organ traders hadn't just found a single dragon. They had found a nesting site, a breeding pair perhaps, and had killed or captured the other adult. This wounded creature had escaped with the younglings, fighting desperately to reach safety before its injuries proved fatal. The dragon's breathing was becoming labored, its great head beginning to droop despite its efforts to stay alert. The extraction devices continued their cruel work, and Marcus could see that the creature was fighting a losing battle against blood loss and system shock. Soon, those three small beings would be left orphaned in the cold vacuum of space, easy prey for scavengers or worse. Marcus made a decision that would haunt and define the rest of his life. He couldn't save the adult dragon. That much was clear, but he might be able to do something for the younglings. Moving with careful, deliberate motions to avoid triggering any defensive responses, he maneuvered his ship closer to the crash site and began preparations to dock with the asteroid. The dragon watched every movement, its eyes never leaving his ship. When Marcus emerged from his vessel wearing a full environmental suit, the creature tensed, a low rumble emanating from its throat that seemed to vibrate through the asteroid itself. But it didn't attack. Perhaps it understood, on some level, that this strange human represented the only chance its offspring had for survival. Marcus approached slowly, his hands visible and empty of weapons. The dragon's massive head tracked his movement, nostrils flaring as it analyzed his scent through filters Marcus couldn't comprehend. When he was close enough to touch the creature's snout, Marcus stopped and waited. The dragon studied him for what felt like an eternity. Then, with obvious effort and pain, it shifted its wings slightly, revealing the three younglings more clearly. They huddled together, their large eyes reflecting Marcus's helmet lights like tiny stars. They were beautiful in an alien way, their scales catching and refracting light in patterns that seemed to shift and change as he watched. The adult dragon's voice, when it came, wasn't heard so much as felt. It resonated through the asteroid, through Marcus's suit, through his very bones. The words, if they could be called words, were incomprehensible, but the meaning was crystal clear. A parent's final request, a plea for mercy and protection for its children. Marcus nodded, knowing somehow that the gesture would be understood. The dragon's great eyes seemed to focus on something far beyond the asteroid, and with a final, shuddering breath, the magnificent creature fell still. The lights in its eyes dimmed and went dark, leaving only the cold stars as witness to its passing. The three younglings began to make soft, keening sounds that cut through Marcus like knives. They nudged at their parent's still form, trying to coax some response, some sign of life from the massive body that had been their entire world. When no response came, they huddled closer together, their cries becoming more desperate. Marcus knelt beside them, moving slowly and carefully. The younglings shrank back at first, but they were too young and too frightened to flee. When Marcus reached out with one gloved hand, the smallest of the three, barely larger than a kitten, tentatively sniffed at his fingers before allowing him to gently stroke its head. The scales were softer than he had expected, with a texture somewhere between silk and warm metal. The youngling made a soft, chittering sound and leaned into his touch, desperate for comfort in its grief and confusion. Soon, all three were pressing close to him, seeking warmth and reassurance from the only living being in their suddenly cold and empty world. Marcus gathered them carefully in his arms, marveling at how light they were despite their apparent solidity. Their scales seemed to regulate their body temperature automatically, keeping them warm even in the freezing vacuum. As he carried them back to his ship, he could feel them trembling against his chest, small bodies racked with loss and fear. Inside the Wanderer's dream, Marcus created a makeshift nest in his cargo hold using emergency blankets and spare clothing. The younglings clung to each other, their eyes never leaving his face as he worked to make them comfortable. He had no idea what baby dragons ate, how long they could survive without their parent, or even if they could digest anything his ship's food processors could produce. What he did know was that he had made a promise to a dying creature, a promise that transcended species and understanding. These three small beings were now his responsibility, and he would do everything in his power to honor that trust. As his ship pulled away from the asteroid and the body of their parent, Marcus looked back through the viewport. The adult dragon's body was already beginning to be covered by the cosmic dust that perpetually drifted through the asteroid field. Soon, it would be indistinguishable from the rock around it, another mystery of the void that would puzzle future explorers. But its children lived. They lived, and they would grow, and perhaps someday they would understand that their survival was a gift paid for with their parents' sacrifice and a human miner's compassion. Marcus set course for his hidden supply depot 3 asteroids away, his mind already working on the practical problems ahead. He would need to research dragon physiology, find appropriate food sources, and, most importantly, figure out how to keep 3 baby apex predators secret from a galaxy that had spent 2 centuries trying to exterminate their species. Behind him, in the cargo hold, the younglings had finally fallen into an exhausted sleep, their small bodies curled together in a pile of scales and warmth. In their dreams, perhaps they still heard their parents' voice, still felt the safety of those massive wings. In time, those memories would fade, replaced by new ones of kindness shown by an unlikely guardian. The universe was vast and often cruel, but sometimes in the darkness between the stars, compassion could take root and grow into something beautiful. Marcus Chun, simple asteroid miner, had no idea that his act of mercy had just changed the course of galactic history. 6 months had passed since Marcus Chun had rescued the 3 dragon younglings from the asteroid field, and his life had become something he never could have imagined. The cargo hold of the Wanderer's dream had been completely transformed from a utilitarian storage space into something resembling a cross between a nursery and a fortress. The younglings had grown remarkably fast. What had once been kitten-sized creatures were now roughly the size of large dogs, their scales having darkened and gained intricate patterns that seemed to shift in the light. They had also developed distinct personalities that kept Marcus constantly on his toes. The largest of the 3, whom Marcus had taken to calling Onyx, due to its deep black scales shot through with veins of silver, had emerged as the natural leader. Onyx was curious about everything, constantly exploring every inch of the ship and testing the limits of what Marcus would allow. The middle child, Ember, had scales that glowed with a warm amber light and possessed an almost supernatural ability to sense Marcus's emotions. When he was tired or stressed, Ember would curl up beside him, radiating a comforting warmth that seemed to ease his troubles. The smallest, Void, remained much as she had been that first night, shy and skittish but incredibly intelligent. Her scales were the darkest of the 3, so black they seemed to absorb light, and her eyes held an ancient wisdom that sometimes unnerved Marcus. She rarely left the others' sides, preferring to observe the world from the safety of the group. Feeding them had been the first major challenge. Marcus had experimented with various mineral supplements, processed metals, and even tried grinding up meteorite samples before discovering, quite by accident, that the younglings could survive on pure energy. When he had accidentally spilled some plasma coolant from his mining equipment, Void had darted forward and absorbed the glowing liquid directly through her scales. Within minutes, all three were feeding, their bodies literally drinking in the energy and converting it to sustenance. The discovery had led Marcus to modify his ship's power distribution system, creating feeding ports where the dragons could tap directly into the ship's reactor output. It was an elegant solution that solved the food problem while also explaining how adult dragons could survive in the vacuum of space, literally feeding on cosmic radiation and stellar energy. Communication had developed gradually and in ways Marcus was still trying to understand. The dragons didn't speak in any conventional sense, but they projected emotions and simple concepts directly into his mind. At first, Marcus had thought he was going mad, hearing voices that weren't there. But as the weeks passed, he began to recognize the distinct mental voices of each youngling. Onyx's communications felt like curiosity given form, a constant stream of questions and observations about the world around them. Ember's touch was warm and comforting, often conveying feelings of gratitude and affection that brought tears to Marcus's eyes. Void's rare mental contacts were brief and intense, flashes of profound understanding that left him feeling as though he had glimpsed something far greater than himself. The younglings had also begun to display abilities that both amazed and worried Marcus. Onyx could generate small electromagnetic pulses that interfered with the ship's electronics, while Ember could raise her body temperature to levels that would have been lethal to most life forms. Void demonstrated the most disturbing ability, occasionally seeming to phase partially out of visible reality, becoming translucent and ghostly before snapping back to full solidity. Marcus had spent countless hours researching what little information existed about void dragons, most of it contradictory and likely fictional. According to the legends, adult dragons possessed abilities that bordered on the supernatural. They could teleport across vast distances, manipulate gravity, and some stories even claimed they could see across multiple timelines simultaneously. If even a fraction of the stories were true, Marcus was raising creatures that would one day be among the most powerful beings in the galaxy. The responsibility was overwhelming, but it was balanced by the genuine affection he had developed for his unusual charges. The dragons, for their part, had bonded with Marcus in ways that went beyond simple imprinting. They followed him around the ship like devoted pets, competed for his attention, and showed genuine distress when he had to leave them alone to conduct mining operations. Onyx had taken to sleeping curled around Marcus's feet, while Ember preferred to drape herself across his shoulders like a living scarf. Void usually maintained some distance, but Marcus often caught her watching him with those ancient eyes, as if she was studying every aspect of his character. The isolation of the asteroid field had been perfect for keeping his secret, but Marcus knew it couldn't last forever. The dragons were growing too large to hide easily, and their energy requirements were beginning to strain his ship's power systems. More concerning were the dreams that had started a few weeks ago. Marcus would dream of vast spaces filled with swirling galaxies, of creatures whose size dwarfed entire star systems, of a cosmic dance that had been going on since the universe began. In these dreams, he saw the dragons not as the monsters the Coalition propaganda portrayed, but as guardians of something precious and ancient. The dreams felt too real, too detailed to be products of his imagination, and he suspected that Void was somehow sharing memories inherited from her parents. The political situation in the galaxy was also growing more unstable. Marcus monitored the news feeds when he could get a signal, and the reports were increasingly disturbing. The Coalition government had been taken over by a faction called the Purity Movement, led by a charismatic leader named Director Thane, who preached human supremacy and the elimination of all aberrant life forms. Under Thane's leadership, the Coalition had begun a new campaign called the Final Cleansing, aimed at wiping out the remaining non-human species that had managed to survive the previous purges. Entire worlds had been sterilized, their populations relocated to containment facilities that everyone knew were death camps. The few alien species that had achieved citizenship in the coalition found their rights stripped away overnight. Marcus knew that if the coalition discovered the dragons, there would be no trial, no questions asked. They would simply sterilize the entire asteroid field and declare it a victory for human purity. The thought of his 3 charges being reduced to atoms in a nuclear fire filled him with a cold rage that surprised him with its intensity. It was during his monitoring of these news feeds that Marcus first noticed the anomalous energy signatures. His passive sensors, designed to detect mineral-rich asteroids, had begun picking up strange readings from the edge of the asteroid field. The signatures were brief and difficult to track, but they were definitely artificial in origin. Someone was watching him. Marcus increased his security protocols, running silent whenever possible and varying his mining routes to avoid establishing predictable patterns. The dragon seemed to sense his increased tension, becoming more alert and staying closer to the ship than usual. Onyx's electromagnetic pulses became more frequent and powerful, while Ember's body temperature fluctuated wildly in response to stress. It was Void who confirmed his suspicions. During one of their rare mental connections, she projected an image that made Marcus's blood run cold. Ships, sleek, predatory vessels with the angular design favored by coalition military contractors. They were maintaining position just outside his sensor range, watching and waiting. Marcus realized that his time of peaceful isolation was coming to an end. Somehow, someone had discovered his secret, or at least suspected that something unusual was happening in this remote corner of space. He began making preparations for a hasty departure, but 3 growing dragons and a mining ship loaded with equipment would not be able to outrun military pursuit vessels. The answer came from an unexpected source. While reviewing his ship's modification history, Marcus discovered that his power distribution changes had created a resonance effect with the dragon's natural energy manipulation abilities. When all 3 younglings fed simultaneously, the combined energy drain created a brief but powerful electromagnetic pulse that could disable nearby electronic systems. It was a desperate plan, but Marcus began training the dragons to coordinate their feeding cycles. Onyx, with his natural leadership tendencies, quickly grasped what Marcus wanted and began teaching the others. Within days, they could generate a pulse powerful enough to shut down his ship's non-essential systems for several minutes. The test came sooner than expected. Marcus was conducting a routine mining operation on a medium-sized asteroid when his proximity alarm screamed a warning. 3 coalition patrol ships had appeared at the edge of the field, moving in a search pattern that would bring them to his position within hours. Marcus gathered his charges in the modified cargo hold, his heart pounding as he prepared to put their lives in the hands of creatures barely older than infants. The dragons seemed to understand the gravity of the situation, arranging themselves in a triangular formation around the main power coupling. Through his viewport, Marcus could see the coalition ships growing larger as they approached. Their weapon systems were charged and ready, and he had no doubt that they would shoot first and investigate the wreckage later. Everything depended on timing and the untested abilities of 3 young dragons who trusted him with their lives. The lead patrol ship was within scanning range when Marcus gave the signal. The dragons began to feed, their scales glowing brighter as they drew power from the ship's reactor. The energy buildup was incredible, far beyond anything Marcus had measured before. The very air in the cargo hold seemed to crackle with potential. When the pulse finally discharged, it was like a miniature star-going supernova inside his ship. Every electronic system shut down instantly, plunging the Wanderer's dream into darkness and silence. But the effect on the coalition ships was even more dramatic. Their engines went dead, their weapons powered down, and their navigation systems failed completely. In the confusion that followed, Marcus used his ship's backup chemical thrusters to navigate deeper into the asteroid field, taking advantage of the natural cover provided by the floating rocks. By the time the coalition ships had restored power and resumed their search, the Wanderer's dream had vanished into the maze of cosmic debris. But Marcus knew this was only a temporary reprieve. The Coalition would send more ships, better equipped and prepared for electronic warfare. His secret was no longer safe in the asteroid field, and soon he would have to make a choice between his own survival and the lives of the three creatures who had come to trust him completely. As he sat in the darkened cargo hold, surrounded by the warm presence of the dragons, Marcus began to formulate a plan. It was dangerous, possibly suicidal, but it might be their only chance. The galaxy was vast, filled with hidden worlds and forgotten systems. Somewhere out, there was a place where dragons could grow to maturity in safety, where they could reclaim their heritage and, perhaps, one day, remember the human who had shown them kindness in their darkest hour. The journey ahead would test them all in ways they couldn't imagine. But, looking into the trusting eyes of his unusual family, Marcus Chin knew he would face any danger to keep them safe. After all, some promises were worth dying for. The journey to the Forgotten Reaches had taken 3 months of careful navigation through unmapped space, avoiding trade routes and inhabited systems while following ancient star charts Marcus had purchased from a half-mad information broker on the frontier station of Haven's Rest. The chart spoke of a system so old that it predated the Coalition itself, a place where the first dragon colonies had thrived before the Great Purge reduced them to legend. Marcus had never imagined that the dragons would grow so quickly during their journey. Onyx now stood shoulder-high to a human, his scales having developed an intricate pattern that seemed to shift and flow like liquid metal in the ship's lighting. His electromagnetic abilities had grown proportionally, and he could now generate pulses powerful enough to disable entire space stations if he chose to. More remarkably, he had begun to demonstrate the spatial manipulation abilities mentioned in the ancient texts, occasionally disappearing from one part of the ship and reappearing somewhere else entirely. Ember had developed in a different direction, her amber scales now glowing with a constant inner light that provided warmth throughout the ship. Her empathic abilities had become so refined that she could sense Marcus's emotional state from anywhere on the vessel, often appearing to offer comfort before he even realized he needed it. She had also begun to manipulate energy in increasingly sophisticated ways, creating small constructs of pure force that could perform delicate tasks or serve as tools. Void remained the most mysterious of the three. Her growth had been more subtle, but perhaps more profound. Her scales now seemed to exist slightly outside normal space, giving her an ethereal quality that made it difficult to focus on her directly. She rarely communicated even the simple emotions that her siblings projected, but Marcus often felt her presence in his mind during his sleep, showing him dreams of vast cosmic structures and ancient knowledge that made his human brain ache with its complexity. The system they finally reached after their long journey was everything the star charts had promised, and more. 7 planets orbited an ancient red giant star, but it was the 5th world that had captured Marcus's attention from the moment they entered the system. It was a world of floating continents, massive land masses held aloft by some unknown force field technology that predated human civilization by millions of years. The planet's surface was covered in the ruins of a once great civilization, structures so massive they could be seen from orbit despite being worn down by eons of time. But it was what Marcus's sensors detected among those ruins that made his hands shake as he prepared to land. Energy signatures, faint but unmistakable, indicating that some of the ancient technology was still functional after all these years. The dragons had become increasingly excited as they approached the planet, their mental projections filled with emotions Marcus couldn't quite identify. It was as if they were recognizing something in the planet's energy patterns, some racial memory awakened by proximity to their ancestral home. When they finally landed among the ruins of what had once been a vast city, all 3 dragons immediately pressed themselves against the ground, their scales rippling with patterns Marcus had never seen before. The ruins themselves were breathtaking in their scope and alien beauty. Towers that spiraled impossible distances into the sky, their surfaces covered in crystalline growths that pulsed with soft light. Vast amphitheaters carved from single pieces of what appear to be living stone, their walls covered in relief carvings that seem to move and shift when viewed directly. Gardens where impossible plants still grew, tended by automated systems that had continued their work for millennia without any conscious oversight. But it was at the heart of the ancient city that Marcus made the discovery that changed everything. Hidden beneath a temple complex whose architecture hurt to look at directly, he found the archive. It was a vast crystalline structure that hummed with stored information, terabytes upon terabytes of data preserved in a medium that made human computer technology look primitive by comparison. The archive was clearly designed to be accessed by dragon consciousness, its interface requiring the kind of mental abilities that only the dragons possessed. When Void approached the central crystal, her scales began to glow with reflected light from the archive's core. The connection, when it formed, was visible as streams of light flowing between the dragon and the ancient repository of knowledge. For 3 days, Void remained connected to the archive, her consciousness deep in communion with the stored memories of her ancestors. During this time, Onyx and Ember stood guard, their protective instinct aroused by their sister's vulnerable state. Marcus maintained a respectful distance, understanding that he was witnessing something sacred and profound. When Void finally disconnected from the archive, the change in her was immediately apparent. She had gained not just knowledge, but purpose. Through their mental link, she shared with Marcus glimpses of what she had learned, images that painted a picture of galactic history far different from anything recorded in human chronicles. The dragons, Marcus learned, had not been the mindless monsters that Coalition propaganda portrayed. They had been the guardians of a galaxy, ancient beings whose purpose was to maintain the balance between order and chaos, creation and destruction. They had watched over younger species as they developed, occasionally intervening to prevent catastrophes that would have destroyed entire civilizations. The Great Purge had not been a righteous campaign to eliminate dangerous predators, but rather a systematic genocide orchestrated by forces that wanted to exploit the galaxy without the oversight of its natural guardians. The Coalition itself had been created and manipulated by entities whose ultimate goal was the complete domination of all sentient life in the galaxy. But the archive contained more than just historical records. It held the memories and experiences of thousands of generations of dragons, a collective knowledge base that included scientific principles and technologies far beyond current human understanding. Most importantly, it contained the locations of other hidden sanctuaries, worlds where young dragons could be safely raised and trained in their ancestral duties. Over the following weeks, Marcus watched in amazement as the dragons began to access their inherited memories and abilities. Their growth accelerated dramatically, not just physically, but intellectually and spiritually. They began to demonstrate powers that defied human understanding of physics, manipulating space and time in ways that made Marcus realize he was caring for beings that existed on a completely different level of reality. Onyx discovered that his spatial manipulation abilities were just the beginning of his potential. He could create temporary wormholes that allowed instantaneous travel across vast distances, fold space to make their sanctuary invisible to outside observation, and even manipulate the flow of time in localized areas. His leadership qualities became even more pronounced as he began to understand the responsibilities that came with his heritage. Ember's empathic abilities evolved into something approaching telepathy, not just with Marcus and her siblings, but with the planet itself. She could communicate with the ancient automated systems that maintained the ruins, coaxing them to extend their protection to the human who had cared for them. Her manipulation of energy became so sophisticated that she could literally reshape matter at the molecular level, healing damaged structures and even creating new technological devices from raw materials. Void's transformation was the most dramatic of all. Her connection to the archive had awakened abilities that bordered on precognition. She could perceive potential futures, track the movements of distant enemies, and occasionally glimpse events that were happening in other parts of the galaxy. Her ability to phase out of normal reality became more pronounced, and Marcus sometimes found it difficult to determine whether she was physically present or existing in some parallel dimension. But perhaps the most remarkable change was in their relationship with Marcus himself. As the dragons grew into their powers, their gratitude and affection for him deepened rather than diminished. They understood now what he had saved them from, what his kindness had meant in the context of their species' near extinction. The bond between them transcended mere friendship or even family, becoming something that Marcus could only describe as profound love. The dragons began to share their abilities with him in small ways. Ember would use her energy manipulation to strengthen his aging body and extend his lifespan. Onyx would fold space around him during their explorations of the planet, allowing him to survive in environments that would have been instantly lethal to unprotected humans. Void would share glimpses of her enhanced perceptions, showing him visions of beauty and wonder that brought tears to his eyes. It was during one of these shared experiences that Marcus first learned about the growing threat to their sanctuary. Through Void's far-seeing abilities, he witnessed the Coalition's massive military buildup, saw the fleets of starships being assembled for something called the Final Solution. Director Thane's forces were not content with merely eliminating the known alien populations. They were systematically searching every remote system in the galaxy, determined to root out any remaining traces of non-human intelligence. The search pattern would eventually bring them to the Forgotten Reaches, and when it did, even the ancient defenses of the Dragon homeworld might not be enough to protect them. Worse, the archive contained evidence that the Coalition's backers were not human at all, but rather entities from outside the galaxy whose ultimate goal was the complete subjugation of all local life forms. Marcus found himself faced with an impossible choice. They could remain hidden on the Dragon homeworld, safe for the moment, but ultimately doomed when the Coalition's search finally reached them. Or they could take the fight to their enemies, using the Dragon's awakened powers to strike back against the forces that had nearly driven their species to extinction. It was Onyx who made the decision for them. Through their mental link, he projected images of other hidden sanctuaries, worlds where scattered survivors of the Purge might still be hiding. If the Coalition's Final Solution succeeded, those refugees would be found and eliminated one by one. But if the dragons revealed themselves now, if they showed the galaxy that the Guardians had returned, they might be able to rally the survivors and turn the tide of the war. The plan that emerged from their discussions was audacious to the point of insanity. They would strike at the heart of the Coalition itself, targeting Director Thane's flagship during a major military ceremony. The attack would be broadcast across the galaxy, showing that the age of human supremacy was coming to an end and that the ancient Guardians had returned to reclaim their role as protectors of all life. Marcus knew the plan would likely mean his death. He was just a human, fragile and short-lived compared to the cosmic beings his actions had helped to create. But as he looked into the eyes of the three dragons he had raised from helpless infants, he felt a peace he had never known before. He had helped to restore something precious to the galaxy, and whatever happened next, that gift could never be taken away. The dragons had other plans for him, however. Through their combined abilities, they began to work changes in Marcus's body and mind that would allow him to survive what was to come. Ember strengthened his cellular structure until he could survive in the vacuum of space. Onyx taught his consciousness to exist partially outside normal time, protecting him from the worst effects of temporal manipulation. Void shared fragments of her cosmic awareness, expanding his mind until he could perceive the deeper patterns that governed reality itself. When the transformation was complete, Marcus Chun was no longer quite human, but he was something more as well. He had become the bridge between species, the living symbol of what could be achieved when compassion transcended the barriers of biology and prejudice. As they prepared to leave their sanctuary and face the uncertain future ahead, Marcus realized that his simple act of mercy in the asteroid field had grown into something that would reshape the entire galaxy. The dragons he had saved were no longer just 3 orphan younglings, but the vanguard of a returning species that would not allow their galaxy to fall to those who would destroy all diversity of life. The universe was about to discover that humanity's greatest strength had never been its military might or technological advancement, but rather its capacity for compassion and its willingness to protect those who could not protect themselves. And sometimes such compassion would be rewarded in ways that exceeded all imagination. The Coalition's Victory Day celebration was the largest military gathering in human history. In orbit around the capital world of Terra Prima, over 3,000 warships had assembled to commemorate the completion of the final cleansing campaign. Director Thane's flagship, the Purifier, sat at the center of this massive fleet like a steel cathedral dedicated to human supremacy. Aboard the flagship, representatives from every human world had gathered to witness what they believed would be the dawn of a new age. The alien populations have been eliminated, their worlds claimed for humanity, and their resources absorbed into the Coalition's ever-expanding empire. According to the official reports, the galaxy was finally pure, finally safe for human expansion. Director Thane himself stood at the observation deck of the Purifier, looking out at the assembled fleet with satisfaction. He was a tall, imposing figure with pale skin and cold blue eyes that seemed to burn with fanatic intensity. Behind him, his advisors and military commanders waited in respectful silence, their uniforms decorated with medals commemorating their participation in various extermination campaigns. Today, Thane announced to the assembled dignitaries, "We celebrate humanity's greatest triumph. For too long, our species has been forced to share this galaxy with inferior life forms, creatures whose very existence threaten the purity of human civilization. But no longer. Today we stand alone in a galaxy that belongs entirely to us." The assembled crowd erupted in applause, their voices echoing through the massive chamber. Outside, the celebration continued with elaborate military displays, holographic presentations detailing the success of the final cleansing, and patriotic music that could be heard even in the vacuum of space through the ship's communication arrays. None of them noticed the small distortions in space that had begun to appear at the edge of the fleet formation. To their sensors, they looked like minor gravitational anomalies, the kind of natural phenomena that occurred near large concentrations of mass. Even if they had detected something unusual, the Coalition's arrogance had grown so complete that they couldn't imagine any force in the galaxy capable of threatening their assembled might. Marcus Chun materialized first, his transformed body protected by a shimmering field of energy that Ember had woven around him. He appeared on the bridge of a Coalition destroyer on the fleet's periphery, his presence triggering immediate alarms as the ship's sensors detected the impossible readings emanating from his enhanced physiology. Before the ship's crew could react, Onyx materialized beside him. The dragon's form had changed since their time in the sanctuary, growing larger and more imposing while gaining an otherworldly quality that made him difficult to look at directly. His scales reflected light in patterns that seemed to bend space around him, and his eyes burned with power that made the ship's energy readings spike off their scales. The destroyer's captain, a veteran of a dozen cleansing operations, reached for his weapon before recognizing the futility of the gesture. This was no human rebel or alien survivor. This was something else entirely, something that radiated power beyond anything in his experience. "Attention, Coalition fleet." Marcus's voice echoed across all communication channels simultaneously, amplified by Ember's energy manipulation and broadcast by Onyx's spatial abilities. "You have claimed to have purged the galaxy of all non-human life. You were wrong." Across the fleet, confusion and panic began to spread as officers tried to understand how their communications had been hijacked and who was speaking to them. On the Purifier's bridge, Director Thane's face had gone pale as he stared at the impossible readings his sensors were providing. That was when Ember appeared in the heart of the celebration itself, materializing in the flagship's observation deck like a living star. Her amber scales blazed with energy that illuminated the entire chamber, and Her presence sent waves of primal recognition through every human present. This was a dragon, one of the supposedly extinct apex predators that haunted humanity's nightmares. But she was not attacking. Instead, she stood calmly in the center of the room, her ancient eyes surveying the assembled representatives of human civilization with something that might have been pity. When she spoke, her voice resonated not just in their ears but in their very souls. "We are the Void Dragons," she announced, her words carrying across every ship in the fleet through means the Coalition's technology couldn't explain or counter. "We are the Guardians you attempted to destroy, the Watchers you deemed too dangerous to exist. And we have returned." Director Thane found his voice first, his fanatic's certainty overriding his fear. "Impossible. The dragons are extinct. We eliminated every last trace of your species." Ember's response was a gentle sadness that somehow made her more terrifying than any display of rage could have been. "You eliminated the adults, yes, but 3 of us survived, saved by the compassion of one human who chose mercy over fear. We have grown, we have learned, and we remember." That was when Void made her presence known. She didn't materialize like her siblings, but rather seemed to step out of the spaces between reality itself. Her black scales absorbed light so completely that she appeared as a dragon-shaped absence in the universe, visible only by the way space bent around her form. When she spoke, her words carried the weight of cosmic truth. "We know what you truly are," she said, her gaze fixed on Director Thane and his inner circle. "We know of your masters, the entities from beyond this galaxy who have manipulated your species into becoming their instruments of conquest. Your final cleansing was never about human purity. It was about eliminating the guardians who stood between your masters and their goal of total domination." The revelation sent shockwaves through the assembled fleet. Many of the Coalition's officers and soldiers were true believers who had genuinely thought they were fighting for human supremacy. The idea that they had been manipulated by alien influences was almost too much to comprehend. Director Thane's composure cracked entirely, his face contorting with rage and fear. "Kill them," he screamed at his guards. "Kill them all. Use every weapon at our disposal." The Coalition fleet opened fire with everything they had. Thousands of energy weapons lanced out toward the 3 dragons. Planet-killing missiles streaked through space, and gravity bombs that could crush entire moons detonated in massive explosions that lit up the void like newborn stars. None of it touched the dragons. Onyx had folded space around himself and his family, creating a barrier that existed in dimensions the Coalition's weapons couldn't reach. The devastating barrage passed through their position like light through glass, striking nothing but empty space. When the firing finally stopped, the dragons remained exactly where they had been, completely unharmed. "Your weapons cannot touch us," Onyx said, his voice carrying the authority of eons. "We exist on levels of reality that your technology cannot reach. We are what your species might have become if you had chosen the path of wisdom instead of the path of destruction." It was then that Marcus stepped forward, his enhanced form now visible to every camera in the fleet. His appearance sent another wave of shock through the Coalition forces. Here was a human, clearly recognizable as such despite the changes the dragons had worked in him, standing alongside the ancient guardians as an equal. "I am Marcus Chun," he announced, his words carrying to every corner of human space through the Coalition's own communication networks. "I am a human who found 3 orphan dragon children in an asteroid field, and chose to save them rather than destroy them. I am the proof that our species is capable of more than the hatred and fear that your leaders have tried to teach us." His words hit the Coalition fleet like a physical blow. The carefully constructed narrative of human superiority and alien evil began to crumble as soldiers and officers alike were forced to confront the reality of what they were seeing. A human had raised dragons, had been accepted by them as family, and had been transformed by their power into something greater than either species alone. This is the choice that faces humanity now. Marcus continued, his voice reaching across the galaxy through relay stations that the dragon's power had somehow activated. We can continue down the path of genocide and hatred, serving masters who see us as nothing more than tools to be used and discarded. Or we can choose a different path, one of cooperation and growth, one that leads to a future worthy of the stars themselves. Director Thane's response was to activate the Purifier's doomsday weapon, a gravity projector capable of creating artificial black holes. If he couldn't destroy the dragons with conventional weapons, he would tear apart space itself to eliminate them. The massive device began to charge, its energy readings climbing to levels that made nearby ships back away in fear. But Void had foreseen this moment. As the weapon reached full power and prepared to fire, she simply reached out with her consciousness and touched the device's targeting system. The artificial black hole that erupted from the Purifier's main cannon veered away from the dragons and instead engulfed the flagship itself. Director Thane had just enough time to realize his mistake before the black hole consumed his ship entirely, along with several dozen nearby vessels that had been caught in its expanding event horizon. In the space of seconds, the Coalition's supreme leader and his most fanatical followers had been reduced to quantum particles scattered across the void. The remaining fleet stood frozen in shock and terror, their command structure shattered, and their most powerful weapons proven useless. It was Ember who addressed them first, her empathic abilities allowing her to sense the fear and confusion radiating from thousands of human minds. "We do not seek revenge," she said gently, her words somehow carrying personal comfort to every frightened soul in the fleet. "We understand that most of you were deceived, manipulated by forces beyond your control. There is no shame in having been used by those more powerful and cunning than yourselves." Onyx took up the message, his spatial abilities allowing him to project images directly into the minds of every human present. They saw visions of the galaxy as it had been before the purges, a vast community of diverse species working together, sharing knowledge and art and culture across the stars. They saw what the galaxy could become again if the cycle of violence was broken. "Return to your homes," he commanded, his voice carrying the weight of absolute authority. "Tell your people what you have seen here today. Tell them that the Guardians have returned and that a new age is beginning. Those who choose the path of peace and cooperation will find allies among the stars. Those who continue to follow the path of destruction will face the consequences of their choices." Void's contribution was simpler, but perhaps more profound. She touched the minds of key individuals throughout the fleet, removing the mental conditioning that the Coalition's masters had used to control them. For the first time in years, many of these humans were able to think clearly about their actions and the consequences of the wars they had been fighting. The effect was immediate and dramatic. Throughout the fleet, soldiers began laying down their weapons. Officers resigned their commissions, and entire ships declared their intention to leave Coalition space forever. The mighty war machine that had conquered half the galaxy crumbled in a matter of hours as its personnel finally understood what they had truly been fighting for. But the Dragon's work was far from over. Across the galaxy, their message had been received by hidden sanctuaries and refugee populations that had thought themselves alone. Survivors began to emerge from their hiding places, cautiously at first, then with growing confidence as they realized that the age of persecution was truly ending. Marcus found himself appointed as the first human ambassador to the returning dragons, a role that would require him to help rebuild the relationships between species that the Coalition had spent centuries destroying. It was a daunting responsibility, but one that he embraced with the wisdom and compassion that had first moved him to save 3 orphan younglings in an asteroid field. As the shattered remains of the Coalition fleet dispersed to carry news of the dragon's return to every corner of human space, Marcus stood with his 3 companions and watched the first sunrise of a new age. The galaxy would never be the same, but for the first time in centuries, it would be a place where all forms of life could exist together in peace. The seeds of compassion he had planted with a simple act of mercy had grown into something that would reshape the entire universe. And in the vast cosmic dance of creation and destruction, order and chaos, that was exactly as it should be. 50 years had passed since the day the dragons returned to the galaxy. 50 years since Marcus Chin's simple act of compassion had changed the course of cosmic history. The galaxy that emerged from the ashes of the Coalition was transformed beyond recognition. A vast community of diverse species working together to build something greater than any single civilization could achieve alone. Marcus stood on the observation deck of New Haven, a massive space station that served as the diplomatic center of the Reformed Galactic Alliance. The station itself was a testament to what could be accomplished when different species combined their unique talents. Human engineering expertise had been merged with Alterian crystal-growing technology, Nexarian gravitic manipulation, and the space-folding abilities of the dragons to create a structure that existed simultaneously in multiple dimensions. At 93 years old, Marcus should have been long dead by human standards. But his transformation at the hands of the dragons had extended his lifespan far beyond normal limits, while keeping his mind sharp and clear. His hair was white now, and his face bore the lines of age, but his eyes still held the same compassion that had moved him to save 3 dragon younglings in an asteroid field decades ago. The view from the observation deck showed the fruits of their long labor. Ships from hundreds of different worlds moved through the station's docking bays, their crews representing species that had once been thought extinct. The Zephyrians, with their crystalline exoskeletons that refracted starlight into rainbow patterns. The Umbrans, shadow beings who could exist in multiple phases of reality simultaneously. The Melodians, whose very thoughts produced harmonious music that could heal psychological trauma. All of these species, and many more, had survived the Coalition's genocide attempts, hidden away in remote corners of the galaxy or in pocket dimensions beyond the reach of human weapons. The dragon's return had given them hope, and Marcus's example had shown them that not all humans were their enemies. Slowly, cautiously, they had begun to emerge from hiding and join the growing alliance. But perhaps the most remarkable transformation had been in humanity itself. The revelation that they had been manipulated by extragalactic entities had shattered the foundations of human supremacist ideology. Many humans had reacted with shame and horror at what they had been led to do, while others had embraced the opportunity to build something better. The reformed Human Republic, established in the aftermath of the Coalition's collapse, had become one of the Alliance's most enthusiastic members. Human colonies throughout the galaxy had been transformed as their populations learned to work alongside the alien species they had once tried to exterminate. Trade, cultural exchange, and scientific collaboration flourished as barriers that had seemed insurmountable fell away. Marcus smiled as he watched a group of human children playing with young Zephyrians in the station's Central Park. The children's laughter mixed with the musical chimes the Zephyrian younglings made when happy, creating a symphony of joy that would have been impossible just a few decades ago. These children would grow up in a galaxy where diversity was celebrated rather than feared, where cooperation was the norm rather than the exception. Still watching over the younglings, I see. The familiar mental voice made Marcus turn, though he had sensed Ember's approach long before she spoke. The dragon had grown magnificent over the decades, her scales now blazing with an inner light that could be seen from orbit. But, despite her cosmic power, she still enjoyed spending time with Marcus, their bond as strong as ever. Old habits, Marcus replied with a chuckle. Besides, someone needs to make sure they don't accidentally discover how to fold space while playing hide and seek. Ember's mental laughter was warm and comforting. She had become the Alliance's chief diplomat and cultural coordinator, her empathic abilities making her uniquely suited to understanding the needs and concerns of different species. Her work had been instrumental in preventing the cultural misunderstandings that could have torn the fragile Coalition apart in its early years. Onyx sends his regards, she continued. The exploration of the Andromeda approach vector has yielded interesting results. It appears our former masters are not as invincible as they believe themselves to be. Marcus raised an eyebrow. Oh, three of their scout fleets have encountered the defense networks the Andromedans established around their galaxy. It seems we are not the only ones who have had dealings with these entities. The Andromedans fought a similar war 10 million years ago and won. The news was both encouraging and sobering. The extragalactic entities that had manipulated the coalition were still out there, still seeking to expand their influence to other galaxies. But the knowledge that they could be defeated, that other civilizations had successfully resisted their expansion, provided hope for the future. Onyx had spent the last 2 decades leading expeditions to the edges of the galaxy, mapping the approach routes the entities used, and establishing early warning systems. His ability to manipulate space and time made him ideally suited for such work, and his natural leadership qualities had attracted a loyal following among both humans and aliens who were dedicated to defending their home galaxy. "And Void?" Marcus asked, knowing that the most mysterious of the 3 dragons had been pursuing her own investigations into the cosmic forces that threatened all life in the universe. "She continues her work in the deep dimensions," Ember replied, her mental tone becoming more serious. "What she has discovered there is beyond my ability to understand or explain. She speaks of patterns that span entire universal clusters, of conflicts between entities so vast that our galaxy is less than a single grain of sand in their calculations." Marcus nodded thoughtfully. Void had become something approaching a cosmic force herself. Her consciousness expanded to levels that allowed her to perceive reality from perspectives that were almost incomprehensible to lesser beings. She rarely manifested in physical form anymore, preferring to exist in the spaces between dimensions where she could monitor threats that existed beyond conventional space-time. When she did appear, it was usually to deliver warnings about dangers that were still years or decades away, giving the Alliance time to prepare for challenges that would have otherwise destroyed them. Her gift of foresight had already prevented 3 separate invasion attempts by Coalition remnants, and helped the Alliance avoid a plague that would have wiped out several member species. "The Centennial celebration begins tomorrow," Marcus observed, changing the subject to lighter matters. "Are you prepared for your speech?" Ember's embarrassment was palpable through their mental link. Despite her cosmic power and diplomatic expertise, she still became nervous about formal ceremonies. "I still think you should be the one giving the main address. After all, this all started with your decision to save us. And it continues because of what you 3 have become," Marcus replied firmly. "The galaxy needs to hear from its guardians, not from an old human who happened to be in the right place at the right time." The Centennial celebration would mark 50 years since the Dragon's return and the establishment of the reformed Galactic Alliance. Representatives from over 1,000 worlds would attend, along with delegations from several neighboring galaxies that had heard about their success in resisting extragalactic manipulation. But for Marcus, the real celebration had already taken place in the quiet moments over the decades. Watching former enemies learn to work together, seeing species thought extinct return from hiding and reclaim their place in galactic civilization. Witnessing the birth of new art forms, new technologies, and new philosophies that emerge from the fusion of different cultural perspectives. The galaxy had become a place of wonder and possibility, where exploration was driven by curiosity rather than conquest, where scientific advancement served the needs of all species rather than just the dominant one. Diseases that had plagued certain species for millennia had been cured through collaborative research. Technologies that seemed like magic had become commonplace as different civilizations shared their knowledge freely. Most importantly, the cycle of violence that had characterized galactic history for centuries had been broken. Conflicts still arose, of course, but they were resolved through negotiation and compromise rather than genocide. The Alliance had established peacekeeping forces and mediation services that prevented small disputes from escalating into galactic wars. As Marcus stood on the observation deck, watching the peaceful flow of traffic around New Haven, he felt a presence that he hadn't sensed in physical form for several years. Void materialized beside him, her form now so transcendent that she seemed to exist in multiple dimensions simultaneously. "Hello, old friend," she said, her voice carrying harmonics that resonated across multiple levels of reality. "I wanted to thank you before the celebration begins." "Thank me?" Marcus was genuinely puzzled. What could I possibly have done for beings who have become cosmic forces? Void's smile was visible even though her face existed partially outside normal space. "You gave us something more precious than life itself. You gave us the knowledge that compassion exists in the universe, that mercy is possible even between species that seem incompatible. That lesson has shaped everything we have become and everything we have built." She gestured toward the bustling station around them, where hundreds of species that had once been mortal enemies now worked together in harmony. All of this exists because one human chose kindness over fear when faced with 3 helpless younglings. The ripple effects of that single decision have spread across the entire galaxy and beyond. Marcus felt tears in his eyes as he looked out at the civilization they had built together. "I just did what felt right at the time. That is why it mattered," Void replied. "You didn't save us because you expected a reward or because you thought it would benefit your species. You saved us because it was the right thing to do. That kind of pure compassion is what makes a species worthy of the stars." As the 3 dragons and their human guardians stood together on the observation deck, watching the galaxy they had helped to heal, Marcus reflected on the incredible journey that had brought them to this point. From a simple asteroid miner rescuing orphan younglings to becoming the architect of a galactic civilization based on cooperation and mutual respect. The future still held challenges. The extragalactic entities were still out there, still plotting to expand their influence. Other galaxies might need help in throwing off their own oppressors. The universe was vast and full of dangers that could test even the combined might of the dragons and their allies. But Marcus faced that uncertain future with confidence. The galaxy now had guardians again, cosmic protectors who remembered what it meant to be small and helpless and afraid. More importantly, it had millions of beings from hundreds of species who had learned that cooperation was stronger than conquest, that diversity was a source of strength rather than weakness. The celebration that would begin tomorrow would mark the 50th anniversary of the dragon's return, but it would also mark the beginning of something even greater. The Alliance was ready to take its place among the cosmic civilizations that protected life and fostered growth throughout the universe. And at the heart of it all was the simple truth that Marcus Chun had discovered in an asteroid field 50 years ago. Sometimes the most powerful force in the universe is the willingness to show kindness to those who cannot repay it. That kindness, nurtured and grown through decades of trust and cooperation, had become the foundation of a new age. As the celebration began and beings from across the galaxy gathered to honor the dragons and their human guardian, Marcus knew that his life had been well spent. The 3 frightened younglings he had rescued had indeed shown their gratitude, but in ways he could never have imagined. They had given him the chance to help heal an entire galaxy, to be part of something greater than any single species could achieve alone. The stars themselves seemed to shine brighter as the celebration began, as if the universe itself was acknowledging that something precious had been preserved and nurtured into greatness. And in the hearts of billions of beings across the galaxy, the memory of one human's compassion would continue to inspire acts of kindness that would echo through eternity. The dragons had returned, the galaxy was healed, and the future stretched out before them like an infinite canvas of possibility. It was, Marcus thought as he watched the festivities begin, a very good day to be alive in this vast and wonderful universe.